The whip cracked once more, and when the echo faded into the Mississippi night of 1842, a sun made a promise that would stain the earth with vengeance. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shaped the past. We appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. So settle in, relax your mind, and listen closely as we begin a tale of grief, courage, and justice born in darkness. The Mississippi Delta in 1842 was a land that carried two faces. By day it was a sea of cotton stretching beyond the horizon, white fields glowing beneath a punishing sun, while the slow, brown river slid through the land like a silent witness to human suffering. By night, the same fields became a place of whispers and shadows, where the wind rustled through the cotton plants like voices that refused to be silenced. On the Turner plantation, the enslaved people knew that the night belonged to fear as much as the day belonged to labor. The overseer, a hard man named Caleb Rourke, ruled the fields with a whip that seemed to crack as often as thunder in a summer storm. To him, the workers were not men or women, but tools, and broken tools could always be replaced. Yet among those forced to bend beneath the cotton sun lived a young man named Isaac Turner, tall, quiet, and watchful, with eyes that missed very little. Isaac had learned early that survival required patience, silence, and the strength to swallow anger like bitter medicine. His mother, Ruth Turner, had taught him that lesson when he was still a boy, small enough to hide behind her skirts. Ruth carried herself with a quiet dignity that even the overseer's cruelty could not fully erase. She would whisper to Isaac during the rare quiet evenings that a man must guard his spirit even when his body is chained, because a broken spirit is a prison no key can open. Isaac believed her, though each passing year made those words harder to hold on to as the plantation tightened its grip around their lives. Ruth Turner had endured more than most. Her back bore scars that told stories no one dared speak aloud, thin pale lines that crossed her skin like a cruel map of punishment. Still, she worked harder than anyone in the field, partly to protect her son, partly because she understood the overseer's twisted logic. Caleb Rourke respected strength only when it served his profit. Weakness invited attention, and attention often ended with the lash. Isaac watched his mother move through the rows of cotton with steady determination, her fingers quick despite the endless labor. She spoke little during the day, but when the sun fell and the workers returned to the rough wooden cabins, she became a storyteller. She told Isaac about Africa, about ancestors who had once walked free beneath a different sky. She spoke of courage and patience and the belief that justice, even if delayed, always found its path. Isaac listened carefully to every word. Those stories became the foundation of his spirit, though he could not yet know how soon he would need them. The plantation itself was ruled by a distant owner who spent most of his time in New Orleans, counting profits and attending grand dinners. In his absence, the daily power belonged entirely to Caleb Rourke. Rourke enjoyed that power in ways that frightened everyone who lived under his authority. He patrolled the fields on horseback, a rifle across his saddle and the whip always within reach. His temper could turn without warning, and when it did, the consequences were swift and brutal. The enslaved workers had learned to read the small signals that warned of danger, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed when he believed someone was moving too slowly. One humid afternoon in late summer, the tension that had long hung over the Turner plantation finally snapped. The sun burned high and merciless, pressing down on the fields like a heavy hand. Sweat soaked the clothes of every worker as they bent and picked, their baskets slowly filling with cotton. Ruth Turner had been working since dawn without rest. Age and years of hardship had begun to slow her, though she fought against it with stubborn pride. Isaac noticed her movements becoming unsteady as the day stretched on. He wanted to help, to take some of her burden, but the overseer's rules forbade anyone from leaving their assigned rows. When Caleb Rourke rode along the edge of the field that afternoon, he quickly noticed Ruth's slowing pace. To him, it was not exhaustion or age that he saw. It was disobedience. He dismounted from his horse with the cold patience of a man who enjoyed what he was about to do. The field fell silent as he approached Ruth, the only sound the soft rustle of cotton leaves in the hot wind. Isaac's heart began to pound so loudly he was certain others could hear it. He knew what was coming before the whip even left Rourke's hand. The overseer accused Ruth of laziness, of stealing time that belonged to the plantation. Ruth tried to explain that the heat had made her dizzy, but explanations meant nothing to a man who measured humanity in profit and punishment. Rourke ordered her to kneel in the dirt. The workers around them lowered their heads, not out of respect but out of fear of becoming the next target. Isaac stood frozen as the whip cracked through the air. Each strike landed with a sound that seemed to tear through the field itself. Ruth tried to remain silent, refusing to give the overseer the satisfaction of hearing her cry out. But pain has its limits. After several lashes, her strength faltered, and a broken cry escaped her lips. Isaac felt something inside his chest twist and burn. Every instinct urged him to run forward, to throw himself between his mother and the whip, but he knew that doing so would only lead to both of them dying in the dust. So he stood there, gripping the cotton plants so tightly that their stems snapped in his hands. The beating continued far longer than anyone expected. Even some of the other workers began to shift uneasily, aware that the punishment had crossed into something darker. Finally, Ruth collapsed onto the ground, her body no longer able to endure the assault. Caleb Rourke stepped back, breathing heavily, as if the violence itself had exhausted him. He ordered 2 men to drag her toward the shade near the edge of the field. Isaac forced himself to remain still until the overseer rode away. Only then did he run to his mother's side. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes struggling to focus on his face. For a moment she seemed to recognize him and tried to speak. The words came out as little more than a whisper. She told him to stay strong. She told him to remember who he was. Then her chest rose once more, slowly, before falling still. In that moment, Isaac Turner felt the world shift beneath his feet. The stories of patience and endurance that had guided his life suddenly collided with a new, terrible truth. Some wounds demanded justice. And on that silent Mississippi evening of 1842, as the shadows of the cotton fields stretched across the land, Isaac Turner began to understand that the night itself might soon carry his answer. Night settled over the Turner plantation like a heavy curtain, thick with the sounds of insects and the slow whisper of the Mississippi River beyond the cotton fields. Inside the small wooden cabins, the enslaved workers spoke in low voices, careful that no careless word drifted too far into the dark. The death of Ruth Turner had shaken everyone. Many had seen cruelty before, but something about that afternoon had felt different, as if the overseer had crossed a line that even the brutal world of the plantation rarely acknowledged. Isaac sat alone on the rough wooden step outside his cabin, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line, where the shadows gathered like silent witnesses. The grief inside him was deep and heavy, yet it did not explode into wild anger the way some might expect. Instead, it hardened into something colder and more deliberate. His mother's last words repeated in his mind again and again, "Remember who you are." At first, those words felt like a plea for patience, a reminder to endure the cruelty of the world as she had always done. But as the hours passed, Isaac began to hear another meaning beneath them. Remember who you are. Not a tool, not property, not a creature meant only to survive beneath another man's boot. The thought frightened him because it opened a door that could never be closed once stepped through. On a plantation where a whisper of rebellion could bring death, the idea of justice was more dangerous than any weapon, yet Isaac could not push it away. When he closed his eyes, he saw the whip striking his mother's back. When he opened them, he saw the overseer's house standing on the small hill beyond the fields, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. The plantation was quiet after midnight, but it was never truly asleep. Patrol riders sometimes passed along the dirt road, checking for anyone who might attempt escape. Dogs were kept near the barns to warn of movement in the dark. Even the wind carried sounds across the flat land with surprising clarity. Isaac knew all of this because he had spent years watching and listening. His quiet nature had allowed him to move unnoticed in ways others could not, while many of the workers survived by keeping their heads down and their thoughts hidden. Isaac had survived by studying the patterns of the plantation itself. He knew when the patrol riders usually passed the eastern road. He knew which dogs barked at every rustle and which were too lazy to rise unless something truly disturbed them. Most importantly, he knew the habits of Caleb Rourke. The overseer drank heavily most nights, usually beginning shortly after sunset. By the time the plantation fell into silence, he was often deep in his whiskey. His temper softened into a careless arrogance that made him less cautious than he believed himself to be. Isaac had noticed these things over the years without truly understanding why he remembered them. Now those details gathered in his mind like pieces of a puzzle, slowly forming an image he could no longer ignore. Revenge was a dangerous thought, yet the more he considered it, the more it felt like a path that had been quietly waiting for him all along. For 3 days after Ruth Turner's death, Isaac said very little. He returned to the cotton fields each morning like the others, moving through the rows with steady determination. To anyone watching, he appeared unchanged, another silent worker enduring the endless labor. But inside his mind, something was shifting with careful precision. Grief sharpened his attention. Every movement of the overseer, every path taken by the patrol riders, every flicker of lamplight from the big house settled into his memory. Caleb Rourke seemed almost proud of the punishment he had delivered. He rode through the fields with his usual cruel confidence, the whip hanging loosely from his hand as if it were an extension of his authority. Isaac avoided looking directly at him, yet he observed everything from the corner of his eye. He noticed that Rourke often dismissed the field hands early on Saturdays after the cotton had been weighed. The overseer spent those evenings drinking alone in the small house provided for him near the edge of the plantation. Few people approached that building after dark, because everyone understood the danger of disturbing him. To Isaac, that isolation began to look less like authority and more like opportunity. Still, he did not rush toward the thought. His mother had taught him patience, and even now he clung to that lesson. Revenge carried risks not only for him, but for everyone who lived on the plantation. If he acted foolishly, others might suffer. The weight of that truth pressed heavily on his mind. Justice, if it was to come, had to be quiet and precise. On the 4th night, Isaac walked alone to the edge of the cotton fields, where a narrow path led toward the woods. It was a place the workers sometimes visited in secret to find a few moments of privacy away from the watchful eyes of the plantation. The moon hung low above the trees, casting pale light across the land. Isaac knelt beside the soft earth and pressed his hand against the ground, feeling the faint warmth that lingered from the long summer day. For a moment, doubt crept into his thoughts. His mother had spent her life teaching him to survive in a world built on cruelty. Would she truly want him to step into violence now, risking everything she had tried to protect? The question lingered in the quiet night until another memory rose to answer it. He remembered the look in her eyes as she lay dying in the dust of the field. It was not fear he had seen there. It was sorrow mixed with something stronger, something that seemed to ask him to carry forward the dignity she had fought to keep. Isaac slowly stood and looked toward the distant glow of the overseer's house. The plan forming in his mind was no longer a wild dream born from grief. It was becoming a decision. The Mississippi night around him seemed to hold its breath as he turned back toward the cabins, already knowing that the path ahead would lead him into a darkness from which there could be no return. Part 3 will reveal how Isaac Turner begins to move through the shadows of the plantation, preparing for the night when the overseer's cruelty will finally meet its answer. The days that followed moved with the slow rhythm of plantation life, yet beneath that familiar routine, Isaac Turner felt time tightening like a rope being pulled toward its final knot. Each sunrise brought the workers back to the cotton fields, where the endless labor continued as if nothing had changed. Caleb Rourke rode his horse along the rows with the same cruel authority he had always carried, his whip swinging lightly from his hand while his eyes searched for the smallest excuse to remind everyone who held power. To the outside world, the plantation appeared calm. The cotton grew thick and white beneath the Mississippi sun, and the distant river rolled steadily past the land as it had for centuries. But inside Isaac, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The grief that once weighed heavily on his chest had transformed into a quiet resolve. He watched the overseer carefully, studying every movement the way a hunter studies the habits of dangerous prey. Rourke's routine rarely changed. In the early mornings he inspected the fields. By afternoon he often retreated to the shade near the weighing shed, drinking from a tin flask while barking orders at anyone who passed too slowly. When evening came, he returned to his small house near the edge of the plantation, where the glow of lamplight soon flickered through the windows. Isaac noticed how few people went near that house after dark. Even the patrol riders usually passed along the outer road without stopping. The overseer trusted fear to guard him better than locks or companions. That trust would soon become his greatest mistake. During those long days in the field, Isaac spoke very little, yet others began to notice the change in his silence. Old Samuel, one of the oldest men on the plantation, watched him with quiet concern. Samuel had lived long enough to recognize the look that sometimes appeared in the eyes of men who had suffered too much. One evening, as the workers returned to their cabins, Samuel slowly walked beside Isaac along the narrow dirt path. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sky above them glowed with the deep orange light of sunset, and the air carried the smell of warm soil and crushed cotton leaves. Finally, Samuel placed a gentle hand on Isaac's shoulder. He did not ask questions directly, because on a plantation, questions could be dangerous things. Instead, he spoke softly about Ruth Turner. He remembered her kindness and the strength she carried through years of hardship. Isaac listened without interrupting, though each word stirred the memory of his mother's voice telling stories in the dim light of their cabin. When Samuel finished speaking, he studied Isaac's face for a long moment. Then he said something that lingered in the young man's mind long after the old man walked away. Samuel said that a man must sometimes carry fire inside his heart, but he must also be careful not to let that fire burn the innocent. Isaac understood the warning. Revenge might bring justice, but if handled poorly, it could also bring suffering to those who had already endured too much. That truth settled deeply in Isaac's thoughts as he continued preparing for the night that was slowly approaching. By the end of the week, Isaac had gathered everything he believed he would need. None of the items were unusual on a plantation. A small work knife used for cutting rope and repairing tools rested hidden beneath a loose board inside his cabin. A thick cloth sack, often used to carry cotton, waited folded beside the doorway. Even the path he planned to follow had been walked many times before during ordinary nights, when workers slipped quietly toward the woods for a brief moment of freedom from the crowded cabins. Yet this time the journey would carry a different purpose. Isaac carefully chose the night for his plan. Saturday evenings were always the same on the Turner plantation. After the final cotton was weighed, the workers were dismissed slightly earlier than usual, giving them a few hours before darkness settled completely over the land. Caleb Rourke often celebrated the end of the week with heavy drinking, Confident that fear and distance would keep everyone far from his door, Isaac waited patiently as that familiar Saturday arrived. The day passed slowly beneath the burning sun. The workers moved through the cotton rows, while cicadas screamed from the trees along the riverbank. Isaac forced himself to maintain the same steady pace he had shown all week. Any sudden change might draw attention, and attention was the one thing he could not afford. When the final baskets were weighed and the workers were released for the evening, he returned to his cabin with the same calm steps as everyone else. Inside, the small room felt quieter than ever before. He knelt beside the loose floorboard and retrieved the knife, turning it once in his hand before slipping it carefully into the cloth sack. Night fell slowly across the Mississippi Delta, spreading shadows over the cotton fields until the land seemed to dissolve into darkness. One by one, the lanterns inside the cabins flickered out as exhausted workers surrendered to sleep. In the distance, a dog barked once, then settled back into silence. Isaac waited until the night felt deep and still before stepping quietly outside. The air carried the warm scent of earth and river water. Above him, the sky stretched wide and clear, scattered with stars that shimmered faintly through the humid air. For a moment he paused, listening to the familiar sounds of the plantation. Somewhere near the barns, a horse shifted its weight. Farther away, the faint echo of laughter drifted from the overseer's house, followed by the dull clink of a bottle against a wooden table. Caleb Rourke was already drinking. Isaac adjusted the cloth sack over his shoulder and began walking toward the narrow path that led through the cotton fields. Each step felt deliberate, measured, and strangely calm. The fear that might have stopped another man seemed distant now, replaced by a steady focus that guided him forward. When he reached the edge of the field, he turned once and looked back toward the cabins. Dozens of lives slept within those rough wooden walls, people who had shared years of hardship beneath the same cruel system. Isaac understood that what he was about to do would not change the world they lived in. The chains of slavery were far larger than a single overseer. Yet sometimes justice began with one moment, one decision made in the silence of the night. With that thought settling firmly in his mind, Isaac Turner stepped into the darkness and began moving toward the house where Caleb Rourke waited, unaware that the Mississippi night was carrying vengeance straight to his door. Part 4 will continue the moment when Isaac reaches the overseer's house and the quiet tension of the night turns into a confrontation that will echo across the plantation. The path that led from the cotton fields to the overseer's house wound through a thin stretch of trees that stood like silent guards between the labor of the fields and the authority of the plantation. Isaac Turner moved carefully beneath their branches, his footsteps light against the soft earth. The night air felt thick and heavy, carrying the distant murmur of the Mississippi River and the restless chorus of insects hidden in the grass. Each sound seemed sharper than usual, as if the land itself were paying attention to what was about to unfold. Isaac paused several times to listen, letting the quiet settle around him before taking another step. The house of Caleb Rourke stood alone on a small rise ahead, its wooden frame faintly visible beneath the pale glow of moonlight. One lantern burned inside, casting a weak yellow light through the window. From where Isaac stood, he could hear the faint scrape of a chair and the dull clatter of a bottle striking the table. The overseer was still awake, still drinking, just as Isaac had expected. For a moment, the young man remained hidden among the trees, studying the scene with calm patience. Fear had not vanished entirely from his mind, but it no longer controlled him. What he felt instead was a deep, steady certainty that the path he had chosen could not be abandoned now. The memory of his mother's final breath moved through his thoughts like a quiet voice guiding him forward. Isaac stepped from the cover of the trees and began crossing the open ground that led toward the house. The grass brushed softly against his legs, while the cloth sack hung quietly at his side. Every movement was slow and deliberate. The lantern light flickered across the window as he approached, revealing the rough outline of Caleb Rourke seated inside at a wooden table. The overseer's hat lay tossed carelessly beside an empty bottle, and another half-filled bottle rested in his hand. Rourke appeared relaxed, perhaps even pleased with himself, as if the world beyond his door contained nothing capable of threatening him. Isaac stopped a few steps from the porch and listened again. The plantation behind him remained silent. No patrol riders passed along the road. No dogs barked in warning. The night felt strangely still, like the moment before a storm breaks across the sky. Slowly, Isaac climbed the short wooden steps that led to the door. The boards creaked faintly beneath his weight, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the overseer shifting his chair inside. Isaac reached for the handle and pushed the door open just enough to step through. The warm glow of the lantern spilled across the room, revealing Rourke seated with his back partly turned. The smell of whiskey hung heavy in the air. For several seconds, the overseer did not even notice that someone had entered his house. Then the door creaked softly as it closed behind Isaac, and Rourke turned his head with a slow, irritated motion. Caleb Rourke stared at the young man standing in his doorway, confusion spreading across his face before anger quickly replaced it. The overseer's eyes narrowed as he struggled to focus through the haze of drink. He demanded to know why an enslaved worker had dared to step inside his home at this hour. Isaac did not answer immediately. He stood quietly, his expression calm yet filled with something deeper than simple defiance. The lantern light revealed the steady intensity in his eyes, a look that made the overseer shift uneasily in his chair. Rourke began to rise, reaching toward the whip that hung from a nail beside the wall. He started to speak again, his voice thick with drunken authority, but Isaac stepped forward before the words could finish leaving his mouth. The cloth sack dropped softly to the floor as Isaac's hand closed around the small knife hidden within it. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly, each movement unfolding with quiet precision. Rourke realized what was happening only when Isaac stood directly before him. The overseer tried to reach for the whip, but the drink had slowed his reactions, and the distance between them had already vanished. Isaac spoke then, his voice low and steady. He told Rourke that the woman who died in the field had a name. Her name was Ruth Turner. For a brief second, something like recognition flickered across the overseer's face, followed quickly by fear. The fear came too late. The struggle itself lasted only moments. The room filled with the sound of overturned furniture and the sharp crash of the lantern striking the table. Rourke attempted to fight back, his strength fueled by desperation, but Isaac moved with the focused determination of a man who had carried this moment in his mind for days. When the struggle ended, the room fell silent, except for the faint crackle of the lantern flame and the heavy breathing of the young man standing beside the table. Caleb Rourke lay motionless on the floor, his authority and cruelty finally stripped away by the same darkness he had used to rule others. Isaac remained still for several seconds, staring down at the overseer as the reality of what had happened settled slowly into his thoughts. The act had not brought the surge of triumph some might expect. Instead, it carried a quiet weight, a mixture of sorrow and finality that seemed to echo through the small wooden room. He thought of his mother again, of the stories she had told beneath the dim lantern light of their cabin. He wondered what she might say if she could see him now. Outside, the night remained calm and silent, unaware that the balance of power on the Turner plantation had shifted in a single violent moment. Isaac bent down, retrieved the cloth sack, and wiped the blade carefully before placing it back inside. Then he turned toward the door and stepped once more into the Mississippi night. Behind him, the lantern flickered uncertainly, casting long shadows across the walls, as if the house itself were struggling to understand the justice that had just been delivered. Part 5 will reveal how the plantation awakens to the shocking discovery of the overseer's death, and how Isaac Turner's actions begin to ripple through the lives of everyone who lived under that brutal system. Dawn crept slowly across the Mississippi Delta the next morning, spreading pale light over the endless cotton fields as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. The river rolled quietly in the distance, and a thin layer of mist drifted above the low ground near the water. On most mornings, the plantation awakened to the same familiar rhythm. Roosters crowed near the barns, horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, and the workers emerged from their cabins with tired eyes as another day of labor waited for them. Yet on this morning, something felt different even before anyone spoke a word. A strange stillness hung over the land, the kind of silence that arrives before people understand the reason for their unease. Isaac Turner stepped out of his cabin with the others, his face calm and unreadable. He had slept very little, though his body showed no sign of the long night behind him. The sky above the plantation glowed with the soft colors of early sunrise, while the cabin slowly filled with the quiet murmurs of waking voices. For several minutes, everything appeared normal. Then a single shout broke through the morning air from the direction of the overseer's house. The cry carried across the fields with such sudden force that every head turned towards the small hill where Caleb Rourke had lived. Within moments, the stillness shattered as frightened whispers began spreading from one worker to another. The discovery had been made by a young stable hand sent to deliver fresh water to the overseer before the day's work began. When the boy pushed open the door of the house, he expected to find Rourke asleep beside an empty bottle, just as he had many times before. Instead, he found the room in disarray, furniture overturned and the lantern still burning weakly beside the wall. The overseer lay motionless on the floor, his authority gone forever. The boy ran from the house in terror, shouting for anyone who could hear him. Soon, several of the plantation hands gathered near the hill, though none dared step inside the building. Word spread quickly across the land. By the time the plantation owner arrived from the main house, drawn by the commotion, dozens of workers had already heard the news. Caleb Rourke was dead. The man who had ruled the fields with cruelty and fear had been silenced during the night. Confusion filled the air as the owner demanded answers that no one could provide. Some believed an escaped worker from another plantation might have passed through the area. Others whispered that perhaps a thief had come looking for money and found more trouble than expected. The owner ordered several men to search the surrounding woods, while sending another rider toward the nearest town to summon the local sheriff. Throughout the growing chaos, Isaac remained quietly among the other workers, his expression unchanged as he listened to the spreading rumors. Inside his mind, Isaac felt a mixture of emotions that were difficult even for him to understand. The moment he had imagined so many times had passed, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than the anger that once filled him. He did not regret what he had done. When he closed his eyes, he could still see his mother lying in the dust of the cotton field, her breath fading beneath the brutal punishment she never deserved. The overseer had chosen cruelty again and again, believing his power placed him beyond consequence. Isaac had simply delivered the answer that no one else could give, yet he also understood the danger that now surrounded him. The plantation owner would not accept the mystery of Rourke's death without searching for someone to blame. Patrol riders would question the workers. The sheriff would arrive with the cold determination of the law, a law that never favored men like Isaac Turner. For now, his safety depended on the same quiet patience that had guided him through the days of preparation. He kept his voice calm when others spoke around him. He nodded when the owner barked orders for everyone to return to their tasks while the search continued. The cotton fields slowly filled again with the movement of workers bending beneath the rising sun, though the usual rhythm of labor carried a new undercurrent of tension. Every whispered conversation circled back to the same question: who had killed Caleb Rourke? As the morning stretched toward midday, the plantation owner grew increasingly frustrated. The search of the nearby woods revealed nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that a stranger had entered or left the plantation during the night. The sheriff eventually arrived on horseback with 2 deputies, their faces stern as they inspected the small house on the hill. They questioned several workers individually, hoping someone might have heard or seen something unusual. Most could offer only the truth that the night had been quiet. Isaac answered their questions with the same steady calm he had shown all morning. He explained that he had gone to sleep shortly after dark and heard nothing until the shouting at dawn. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, perhaps searching for the slightest crack in his composure, but Isaac's face revealed nothing. After several hours, the investigation reached a frustrating standstill. The sheriff finally admitted that without witnesses or evidence, the truth might remain hidden. Caleb Rourke, a man feared by nearly everyone on the plantation, had met his end in the silence of the Mississippi night. By late afternoon, the lawmen rode away, promising to return if new information appeared. The owner ordered the workers back to their cabins, clearly shaken by the realization that even his overseer had not been untouchable. That evening, the plantation felt strangely different. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the cotton fields once more, but the usual fear that accompanied the overseer's presence had vanished. The cabins filled with quiet conversation as workers tried to make sense of what had happened. Some spoke cautiously of justice, though no one dared say the word too loudly. Others simply sat in thoughtful silence, feeling that an invisible weight had lifted from their lives, even if the chains of slavery still remained. Isaac sat alone outside his cabin, watching the sky darken above the land. The stars slowly appeared one by one, bright against the warm southern night. He knew that the world beyond the plantation had not changed. The system that had taken his mother's life continued to exist across the entire South. Yet something important had shifted inside him. For the first time since that terrible afternoon in the cotton field, he felt a quiet sense of balance returning to his spirit. His mother's name had not vanished into the dust without answer. The cruelty that ended her life had faced justice, even if that justice would never be written in any official record. Isaac looked towards the distant line of trees where the river flowed beyond the plantation. Somewhere out there the future waited, uncertain and dangerous, yet filled with possibilities that no whip could fully erase. And in the deep silence of that Mississippi night, Isaac Turner understood that his story was no longer only about vengeance. It had become a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit could still rise and demand to be remembered. After the death of Caleb Rourke, the Turner plantation did not return to the same cruel rhythm it had known before. Something subtle yet powerful had changed in the air, though few people spoke about it openly. Fear had once moved through the fields like an invisible master, guiding every step and every breath. Now that fear seemed uncertain, as if it had lost the voice that once shouted orders from horseback. The plantation owner struggled to restore control, bringing in a temporary overseer from a nearby estate. This new man, called Thomas Bell, arrived with a cautious manner very different from Rourke's violent arrogance. Word of what had happened spread quietly across the county. No one knew exactly how the overseer had died, but the mystery itself carried a warning. Men who ruled with the whip began to understand that their authority did not make them untouchable. Bell chose a careful approach during his first days on the plantation. He rode the fields with watchful eyes, but rarely lifted his voice. When workers slowed under the heavy sun, he shouted orders, yet the crack of a whip was no longer heard echoing across the cotton rows. Some believed Bell feared meeting the same fate as the man before him. Others believed he simply understood that brutality often planted the seeds of its own destruction. Isaac Turner noticed the difference immediately. The fields still demanded endless labor, yet the air no longer carried the same sharp edge of terror that had once followed every movement of Caleb Rourke. Among the workers, the story of the mysterious night began to grow in quiet whispers. No one claimed to know the truth, yet many carried their own private guesses. Old Samuel sat outside the cabins in the evening light, listening carefully to the conversations that drifted through the warm Mississippi air. More than once his thoughtful eyes rested briefly on Isaac before turning away again. Samuel never asked questions. Instead, he continued sharing the kind of quiet wisdom that had helped many younger workers survive difficult years. One evening he spoke about justice in a way that caught everyone's attention. He said that sometimes history moves slowly, like the Mississippi River, carving its path through the land one patient year at a time. But other times history changed in a single moment, when someone decided that enough suffering had already passed. The workers listened in thoughtful silence. No one mentioned Caleb Rourke's name, yet everyone understood the meaning hidden beneath Samuel's words. Isaac remained seated near the doorway of his cabin, watching the fireflies drift above the dark grass, while the old man spoke. Inside his chest he felt a quiet mixture of pride and sadness. The vengeance he had carried out would never appear in books or official records. Yet within the memory of the people who lived there, the truth would continue to move quietly from one voice to another. As the months passed, the plantation entered a strange period of uneasy calm. The cotton harvest continued beneath the same relentless sun, and the workers still faced the harsh reality of bondage that controlled their lives. Yet the shadow that once followed the overseer's footsteps had vanished. Thomas Bell ruled the fields with strict discipline, but rarely crossed the line into cruelty. The plantation owner seemed determined to avoid another scandal that might attract the attention of authorities from the nearby towns. Slowly, the workers began to notice small differences in their daily lives. Breaks beneath the shade of the trees lasted a little longer. Punishments became less frequent. Even the patrol riders who passed along the road seemed less eager to challenge every movement they saw in the fields. Isaac observed these changes carefully. He knew that one man's death had not destroyed the system of slavery that held them captive, yet it had revealed something powerful about the nature of fear and authority. When cruelty ruled without question, it appeared unstoppable. But when someone challenged that cruelty, even in secret, the illusion of absolute power began to crack. The story of the mysterious night traveled quietly beyond the plantation, carried by wagon drivers, traders, and farmhands who passed through the region. With every retelling, the legend grew slightly larger, until some spoke of a ghost-like avenger who punished wicked overseers beneath the cover of darkness. Isaac himself never corrected those stories. He allowed the rumors to move through the countryside like drifting smoke. The truth belonged to him alone, along with the memory of his mother's final words. Sometimes he walked to the edge of the cotton fields at sunset and watched the river reflecting the fading light of the sky. In those quiet moments, he thought about the life Ruth Turner might have lived if the world had been different. He imagined her laughter echoing through a home where no whip could ever reach her. Though those dreams could never come true, they strengthened his determination to carry her memory forward. Every act of quiet resistance, every moment of dignity shown by the workers in the fields felt like a small victory against the cruelty that had taken her life. Isaac understood that his own path would continue beneath the shadow of danger. If the truth of that night were ever discovered, the consequences would be swift and unforgiving. Yet he also knew that the act had changed him forever. He was no longer simply a man struggling to endure the world placed upon his shoulders. He had become a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit could rise and answer injustice with courage. Part 7 will bring the final reflection on Isaac Turner's legacy and the lessons that stories like his leave for future generations. Years passed across the Mississippi Delta, the way seasons always do, quietly and steadily, carrying the lives of countless people forward, whether they wished it or not. The cotton fields continued to stretch across the land, glowing white beneath the sun each harvest season, while the slow river rolled beside them like a witness to every story written in that soil. On the Turner plantation, the memory of Caleb Rourke's death slowly faded from open conversation, yet it never completely disappeared. Stories have a way of surviving in whispers long after the people involved are gone. New workers arrived, some born into the system, others brought from distant places, and with time they began hearing the quiet legend about a night when justice walked silently across the fields. No one could say exactly who had done it. Some believed the overseer had enemies beyond the plantation. Others believed the land itself had answered his cruelty. But among the older workers, the truth moved quietly from one careful voice to another. Old Samuel continued sharing his wisdom beneath the evening sky until age finally carried him beyond the hardships of the world he had endured. Before his final days, he once told a small circle of listeners that justice sometimes travels through human hands when the world refuses to deliver it on its own. Isaac Turner heard those words from a distance and understood the weight behind them. For Isaac himself, life remained a careful balance between survival and quiet purpose. He continued working the fields like everyone else, rising before sunrise and returning to his cabin when darkness settled over the land. The years carved new lines into his face, yet his steady eyes still carried the same watchful awareness that had guided him through the night of vengeance long ago. Inside his heart, he carried the memory of Ruth Turner as clearly as the day she had whispered her final words. Her lessons about dignity and spirit never faded. In fact, those lessons seemed even stronger after everything that had happened. Isaac began quietly sharing her stories with younger workers who gathered outside the cabins after long days of labor. He spoke about courage, patience, and the importance of remembering who they were, even when the world tried to erase that truth. He never mentioned the events of the night when Caleb Rourke died. That part of the story remained his alone, held in silence like a flame that did not need to be seen to keep burning. Yet the spirit behind that act shaped every word he spoke to those who listened. Beyond the plantation, the winds of change were beginning to stir across the nation. Tensions between free states and slave states grew louder with each passing year. Newspapers carried stories of heated debates, escaped slaves finding refuge in northern cities, and voices rising against the system that had ruled the South for generations. Though the workers in the Mississippi Delta rarely saw those newspapers themselves, travelers passing through the region sometimes spoke about the unrest spreading across the country. Isaac listened carefully whenever such stories reached the plantation. He did not know exactly what the future would bring, but he sensed that the world around him was slowly shifting. The same courage that had guided him through his darkest moment might one day be needed again in ways he could not yet imagine. When he stood beside the cotton rows beneath the wide southern sky, he often thought about the generations who had suffered before him and the generations who would come after. History was not only a record of pain, it was also a record of people who refused to let that pain define the limits of their humanity. One evening, many years after the night that changed his life, Isaac stood at the edge of the fields, watching the sun sink slowly beyond the trees. The sky glowed deep red and gold, while the Mississippi River reflected the fading light like a moving mirror. The land was quiet, except for the soft rustle of wind through the cotton plants. In that peaceful moment, Isaac felt the presence of his mother's memory more strongly than ever before. He imagined her standing beside him, her voice calm and steady, just as it had been during the evenings of his childhood. Remember who you are. Those words had once sounded like simple advice, meant to help a young boy survive a cruel world. Now he understood that they carried something far greater, They were a reminder that even when history presses its heaviest weight upon people, the human spirit still holds the power to choose dignity, courage, and justice. Isaac Turner turned his eyes toward the horizon where the river disappeared into the distance. Somewhere beyond that line, the future waited, shaped by countless stories like his, stories of quiet resistance that refused to be erased. And as the last light of day faded over the Mississippi Delta, the legend of the night vengeance of 1842 continued to live on, carried not in books or monuments, but in the enduring memory of those who understood that justice sometimes begins with one brave soul refusing to let cruelty have the final word. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories from the past can be told. And always remember that history is not only about kings and battles, it is also about ordinary people whose courage changed the course of their world in ways that still echo today.